The Mandalorian has officially flopped. When you look at the box office numbers, it's become incredibly clear it's going to be the worst Star Wars film, at least when it comes to performing at the box office itself. It simply wasn't able to get up to par. And that's where most people stop. They look at the actual structure of the movie itself and they say, well, the movie's boring. If this is bad about that, it's bad about it. Of course, it flopped. But in reality, if you look at even deeper into the very idea of the movie in of itself, not just the idea of the movie coming out, not just the plot, but the idea of making a Mandalorian movie, period, you start to see structural problems that make the movie never really have a chance to begin with. Let's be honest, this movie was never going to succeed, and there are three major reasons why was always going to be the case. The first is a major reason that has to do with Mandalorian itself, the characters in the world in which they created in the seasons that prior to it, that goes to its rise and to its fall. The second is a reason that has to do with really Hollywood itself, where Hollywood has treated this franchise and other things similar to it. And the final reason is a reason that has to do with Star Wars, the franchise itself, or at least Disney's version of Star Wars. A reason that when you really look at it, it's going to plague every single Disney Star Wars film that they have already created, and as well as every single film they're going to try to make in the future. Welcome back, Knights of Brimstone. It is your Lord, the Black Lord Brimstone, back with the video. Now here I'm going to talk about The Mandalorian and the structural problems behind The Mandalorian and Grogu film that make sure it was always going to fail. Starting first and foremost, when you really look at the way in which The Mandalorian became famous, the way in which it was structured, you realize that there was a certain plot engine that actually made it work, and that plot engine is something that they have fortunately lost. The plot engine is very simple. When you really think about the first Mandalorian episode, it's just setting up the thing that's going to make the whole car move forward. That's what the engine is. That's what the plot is. It moves the entire story forward. What you had here is this idea of Grogu, the Baby Yoda character. The idea of the Baby Yoda character being given to the Mandalorian himself. Mandalorian's already a super cool character, already has all these abilities, but he's directionless. He had nothing to go towards, ultimately speaking. And because he's nothing to go towards, even though he's a very cool character, he's not really a main character at this moment. In order to be a main character, you actually have to have a goal to go towards. He didn't have that, but Baby Yoda provided that goal. It became first protect the child at all costs, which of course is the first couple episodes where he's doing everything he can to protect the child, and thus of course he ends up having all these sorts of major problems with people trying to obviously capture the child, Baby Yoda, Grogu, so on and so forth. So that's the first thing that he really has to deal with. And then of course he's protected from this future bounty hunters, from the Empire itself. But there's always an end goal there. The end goal is that we got to find a place to keep the child safe and let the child be able to grow and get more powerful and basically fulfill its destiny, so to speak. Or even just be safe, honestly. That's something that even that's allowed. And within the story, there's several ideas that really start to take shape over the course of the first two seasons. We did a really good job of this. In the end, the idea became get him to Luke, essentially. Get him to learn with the rest of the Jedi, the rest of the people who have the Force. And through that, he will be able to be, fulfilled. But through that, he'll be safe. Through that, the task will be done and the mission will be over, essentially. Unfortunately, Baby Yoda was too popular, and so was the Mandalorian, and thus they decided to retcon the idea of giving it to Luke, just change it all up in the third season, rather at the end of the Boba Fett show, which is again another different thing. But regardless, they did it in the Boba Fett show. They reversed all that and just gave him back to Mandalorian, setting them both at 0. Unfortunately, since the Empire was mostly defeated at that point in time, they tried to revamp the Empire thing, but again, that didn't really work. You ultimately had a situation where the Mandalorian and Grogu were listless. They had no direction to go towards. Yes, they could run from the Empire and from Gino, I forget his name, I can't say his name properly, but you know what character I'm talking about, the main villain of the series. Even though that was the main idea of running away from him, they didn't have something to run towards. There was no end goal with the overall universe because they had taken away that engine. They decided instead of just getting to our path, getting to our goal, let's instead take that out and see if it still works without the actual engine of the plot. And thus, of course, it started to fail. Third season, of course, fell off. Most people didn't even watch it. And that was the same problem people are going to run into when you went to the Mandalorian and Grogu movie. Ultimately speaking, there's no plot engine in that movie to begin with. Nothing that draws you in to the movie. You can tell us with the trailers alone. It was like they're just doing random things. And all those random things were, again, cool things when they were not actually involved in the overall plot. They were side things. Again, to continue the car analogy, they were a nice little paint job, they were a nice furnishing of the car, the nice hull of the car, and so on and so forth. They were really cool parts of the car, but they weren't the engine that made the car run. So what you had there is something that looks very nice, but ultimately speaking is completely useless. And that's unfortunately what they ran into with trying to take away that plot part of it. But even without that plot part of it, there was another element that, again, Hollywood started to do that just killed the entire franchise from the beginning. And that second part that, again, Hollywood really put in there, not necessarily Star Wars entirely their fault, but again, partly Star Wars' fault, is just that there's a bunch of franchise fatigue. We've all heard about it, we all know about it. A lot of us have even felt the idea of this franchise fatigue because, again, Hollywood has continuously used a bunch of franchises to try to give themselves money. Unfortunately, they continue to make these franchises really bad, to be honest with you. Most of their entries are duds or disasters. That's just the way that Hollywood has currently handled many of their franchises. And then Star Wars is not just an exception. He's not just not an exception to the rule, but on top of it not being an exception, it's actually one of the main culprits, one of the main examples people point to show how Hollywood has done a terrible job of continuously adapting and protecting these franchises, of handling these franchises, of managing them. And you really see this again with Star Wars. When you look at the general public, the movie-going public, so not talking about the Star Wars shows yet, we'll talk about them in a second, but when you talk about the actual Star Wars movies that came out, what you typically see is that they were duds or disasters. These sequel trilogies were a bunch of duds and a disaster or two in there. In fact, you could argue all three of them were disasters, but we'll say at least Force Awakens was probably, we'd say, just a dud rather than a complete and utter disaster like Last Jedi and the Rise of Skywalker really was. But when you continue to go on and you look at the other stuff that came out, Rogue One was actually pretty solid. It wasn't great, but it was solid. It wasn't like, again, really good. It was just, again, a solid movie. And then you have another disaster or dud, whichever one you want to say, for Han Solo. So essentially the movie going public, the Star Wars going public, the casuals, so to speak, they haven't seen anything good out of Star Wars for the last couple of years. In fact, many people didn't even like the prequels, and thus you have basically over several decades of no good Star Wars movies coming out for the general public and the way that they view things. When it comes to the actual Star Wars fans, we're going to watch basically everything that comes out. See the same thing when it comes to the shows themselves. Mandalorian was one of the few good shows that popped up, which makes sense to make another movie about him in that specific context. Again, ignoring all the other parts of the context, just looking at the fact that Mandalorian was a solid show and after brought a lot of people back to Star Wars, you can understand the idea of making a movie about him from that perspective, going again all the other different factors. But Mandalorian is just one of the many shows that came out. There were other shows that came out that didn't do that, or that were solid but didn't do too much. Shows again like Small Shadow just came out. That show is a good show. You talk about Bad Batch being good. Rebels was pretty solid. Some people say good to great. I would say solid on that. And I would say and the show of Andor was an absolute masterpiece. That said, very few people watched it. All these shows, despite being pretty good, all had different problems with them, and a lot of people didn't watch a lot of these shows. But that's because of the many duds and disasters that came out. Plus that, you had shows like the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, another disaster to Obi-Wan Kenobi, the character, and to the world and the universe itself. You had another disaster with the Acolyte. You had these different shows that would come out that just really destroyed all the hope that Star Wars really had. Or you had shows that were just, again, kind of just random duds that didn't really push the needle in any way, shape, or form. And because of all these failure after failure after failure, and mediocre film after mediocre film, you basically had a situation where Mandalorian just had no real expectations to be great anymore. even though Mandalorian itself was solid as a show, the first 2 seasons, by the way. But the 3rd season, of course, was an utter dud, which kind of, again, killed off the momentum that it had. And then on top of it, you had shows like Boba Fett, which is connected to the Mandalorian, technically speaking, which was a complete and utter disaster. And ultimately speaking, you had a situation where the Mandalorian didn't have enough hype to even make a movie in the first place. This is due to, again, Hollywood and the franchise system entirely. But again, even though you can blame that again on Hollywood to a certain extent, and you can blame it again on Disney itself, there's another problem that Star Wars, specifically the sequels, brought up that is going to affect every single Star Wars movie that Disney is ever going to make. The third and final problem is really the idea of Star Wars itself when it comes to the sequel trilogy. You see, unfortunately, this is kind of the reason why I said you gotta go back and not keep going forward, because unfortunately, the Star Wars sequel trilogy completely cuts off all the narrative potential of everything that came before it. That's what it does, ultimately speaking. The same thing goes for the actual space between the prequel and the original trilogy. The problem is that they're trapped by the lore that they've already created. So when it came to the idea of good old Baby Yoda, Grogu, being part of Luke's Academy of Jedi, is that ultimately speaking, even though that was the end goal and that was a suitable goal, all it took was a couple of seconds of thinking on that goal to realize, actually, that's terrible. And people started talking about that almost immediately after Mandalorian Season 2 came out. They started talking about, wait a minute, Luke's entire Jedi Order, according to, again, the terrible sequel trilogy, it gets destroyed. And everyone in there gets killed besides Kylo Ren. And so, ultimately speaking, when you actually look at the way in which the end was set up thanks to the sequel trilogy, the way that they destroyed the legacy of many of the original characters, there was no future for characters put before the sequel trilogy. There simply was no future for them. The only option for them was simply to be destroyed or become irrelevant. Those were the only 2 options they really had. The same thing, again, is something that they've been dealing with for Star Wars the entire time. Every time you see a movie or a TV show that's put between the Empire, when the Empire's reign was going on, right before the New Hope movie, you always end up running into the same exact problem. Nothing these characters do is going to be effective in the overall trilogy, in the overall grand scheme of things within the Star Wars universe, because we've already written what happened there, and they weren't involved. And thus, they either have to retire, go off on their own, and basically abandon the fight entirely, which can both be a good thing and a bad thing, depending on how you handle it. It's very difficult to handle it properly, because you have to have this idea that these heroic and really good characters, some reason, simply say, you know what, I'm out. I don't really need to save the galaxy. I'm good, actually. I'm just going to hang out on a beach off on the side and let the rest of you guys deal with that stuff. That's not a really great thing for a main character, or even for heroic characters to have in general. So, of course, you're going to run into that major issue with every single story that you tell during the Empire situation. You're going to run into the same problem when it comes to making stories after the Empire, because ultimately speaking, everything that the Republic built, thanks to the way that they did Rey, thanks to the way they did the whole Luke running away, Luke's temple being destroyed, the idea of the New Republic getting completely destroyed and decimated by the First Order, everything that they built comes to nothing. It all falls to dust in the end. And because of that, you understand almost like implicitly that ultimately speaking, all these characters that you may grow to love in the meantime, in these small little stories, they have no good end for them in the end. Their end will be, quite frankly, terrible. And that's a major issue that, again, the entire Star Wars universe has been running towards. The sequel trilogy made it worse. If you had taken the sequel trilogy out, you at least would have this idea that I'm involved in Luke's temple. There's a future there. If I'm involved in the New Republic, there's a future there. But instead, you have this idea where even then there is nothing past that. You can only make movies and TV shows past the sequel trilogy, but even then you have to deal with the whole Rey situation, and that's just terrible in of itself. No one cared about any characters that come after the sequel trilogy. That's the first problem with it. And then characters that come beforehand just can't get a good ending, which means that essentially the sequel trilogy really killed Star Wars and helped kill The Mandalorian and Grogu. There was no way the Mandalorian and Grogu movie could ever take place and ever be done well. And that's the reason that the characters themselves could end in a great way, because ultimately speaking, their end was always going to run smack dab into the wall, the spiked wall that is the sequel trilogy, which is why, again, the Mandalorian and Grogu movie never really stood a chance.